If you're interested in making a detailed platformer just like this one, within Gamemaker, using drag and drop, then keep watching.
G'day gamers, and welcome back to our drag and drop platformer series. One thing that has been missing from our game has been controller support. So even if you haven't done the rest of the course, you could still follow along on this one and use a similar method to add controller support to any of your drag and drop projects. So to add a controller, we need to modify how we are capturing our current inputs. I added them in a simple way back at the start of the series, but to offer dual controller or keyboard support, we need to improve them. Instead of applying the key presses directly to our HSP, let's capture the keys being pressed and then use the calc movement script to apply them. The first thing I'm going to do is change the get input so it captures the key being pressed instead of applying it directly to our HSP. So if we're pressing right, I want to set the value of right to be true. And if we're pressing left, we'll set left to be true. Just like we do for up. Now I'm going to take a copy of the up, both of those, Control C, Control V, and make sure I drag them underneath the up. And we'll set this for down, and we'll set down to be true as well. Now, because I'm using down and I'm using left and right, we need to declare those variables. So up here where we're assigning our variables, let's create some new ones. So let's have a right, and I'm going to set that to false. Going to have left, false, and then we also created a down. So I'll set that to false as well. Now I'm going to add two more here, which we're going to use when we capture our gamepad. So I'm going to have a H move, standing for horizontal move. I'm just going to set that to 0. And then a V move, and I'll set that to 0 as well. Now, this resetting of the variables is something that we can use elsewhere. So I'm going to do my favorite thing, and that is move it all into a script. So let's grab that and let's cut that out. Let's create a new script, and I'm going to call this reset input. And let's just paste that in. Now when we go back to our get input, we need to call that script here. So drag the execute script block across, and let's select that. So when we run our get input, we're resetting our variables first. If we have control, then we're capturing the input. So before we capture the input for the keyboard, let's capture the input for the gamepad. I'm going to do that just here. So let's create a new script to do that. And I'm going to call this get underscore input underscore gamepad. So just here, we can actually execute the script, and let's call the get input gamepad right there. So back in that script, this is where we want to capture the input from the gamepad. Now Gamemaker can detect up to 12 controllers, and each one is allocated a port number from 0 to 11. So what we can do is loop through those values and see if any of them have a controller attached. Now an Xbox controller will be found on port 0, while a PS4 controller will actually be found on port 4. So to make it easier, as soon as the controller has been found, we will use that one and not look for any others. Also, since modern controllers are analog, the sticks have a dead zone, which means how far they need to move until they are recognized. The analog sticks are not perfectly centered, and this stops unwanted movement. So let's set that value first, then create our loop. I'm just going to set a temporary variable, and I'll call it dead underscore zone, and I'll set it to 0.3. But the analog input is captured between 0 and 1. So 0.3 means you have to move the analog stick a little bit before it starts to recognize that it has some movement. Now let's create the loop that will loop through the ports. So I'm going to just search for a for loop and drag that in. And we're going to run it from 0 up to 12, which means it'll go from 0 to 11. And this is temporary. We don't require this variable afterwards. So if we type in Gamepad, we'll see there's a bunch of Gamepad code blocks. I'm going to drag in the get Gamepad connected code block. And the Gamepad port that we want to look for is I, because that's our loop. And we're going to store it in a variable. I'll just call it connected. And this will be set to true if this port has a Gamepad connected to it. So if it does have a Gamepad connected, then we need to do something with it. So we can say if this variable connected is equal to true, then the first thing we want to do is use our dead zone. So we go back to our gamepads. We can set our dead zone here. And we want to set it for the Gamepad port, which is I. And the dead zone is our variable created. It's called dead_zone. So the next thing we can do is capture the axis input. So that's whether the controller stick is being moved. So there's one here called get Gamepad axis. So let's drag that across. And once again, the port we're looking at is I. Now the axis we want to get is the Gamepad axis left horizontal. And that's what this stands for. You can choose different options here. We want the left stick, the horizontal of the left stick. Now I'm going to store that in a variable called hmove, and that's what we created earlier, standing for the horizontal movement. So this will actually return a value between -1 and 1. And that value is a real number, meaning it's a decimal. So -1 means you are pushing all the way to the left on the analog stick. 1 means you're pushing all the way to the right. Now we can also store the vertical movement. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to take a copy of this and paste it. And this time I'm going to look at the left stick vertical. And I'm going to store that in our vmove. Now make sure you don't tick temp. We want to keep these and use them in calc movement later. Now the other thing we want to capture is if the player is jumping. So we can grab a gamepad button pressed, which means it was only pressed once. And we're looking at the port of I, and the button we're looking at is the action button. So on a controller, top normally is your Y. On an Xbox controller, you got an X for left, A for bottom, and B for right. So for our jump, I'm just going to use the action bottom button. Now, if that is true, we need to do something. We need to set our variable, and the variable we set is our jump variable. We want to set jump to be true. Now, as I mentioned, I don't want to process any more controllers. If we've captured this input, then I'm just going to use that one. So we can do a break, and we can place that down the bottom. And what that means is that we will jump out of this for loop and not run any more once we get to the end there. But now that we've captured the input, let's use it inside our calc movement. Since we'll be using input variables here and our enemy and coin use the calc movement script too, we need to give them their own script. But then we're free to make changes on this one. So let's duplicate the calc movement script, and I'm going to call the new one calc movement _other. And if we go into our objects and go to our enemy, we see that at one point they are using calc movement. So we need to just change that and ensure they use the other script. And that's the only time they use it. And our coin also uses calc movement, and that's in the object parent. Here it is here. So let's change that to other as well. So that lets us use calc movement now for the player only. So when we introduce analog movement, meaning it's not just stop and go, but instead it allows decimals like acceleration, we can use that to give our player a smoother movement. We can have slower walking speeds, for example. So let's add a variable to control that acceleration. So back under our player, let's go down to the bottom of our variable definitions and let's add an acceleration. I'll just call it ACC. And I'm going to set it to 1.1. And this is a real. So now in our calc movement, we can set our HSP based on our hmove variable and our acceleration. So if we go here and we assign variable hsp to be whatever h move is times by acceleration. And that's why I set it to 1.1, because this value times 1.1 will increase over time if we tick relative. So hsp will get larger over time. Now if we run that, you'll see it will continue to accelerate as there is no limiting of speed. You can run that and test it yourself, but we can add a clamp function to ensure it never goes above the walk speed value. So let's add another assigned variable. And this time we want to make sure our hsp is clamped, and there's a function called clamp. So I'm going to say clamp, and you'll see that it takes the value and then what you want to set it as the minimum and the maximum. So we're going to take hsp, and I'm going to set the minimum to be minus walk speed, which is our variable we used before to calculate our walk speed, and positive walk speed. So therefore hsp will never be smaller than minus walk speed or larger than walk speed. Now let's run this and try it out. Press play. Now make sure you have a controller plugged in, and we can move and jump, and we can actually move slower. So that works great. We have a nice slow gradual movement speed and also a slight acceleration when starting to move. Now you notice one thing, and that's the keyboard no longer works. So let's fix that up. Now when we were back on our get input, you remember that if we are pressing right or pressing left, then our right is set to true or our left is set to true. So if that's the case, we can just set our H move to 1 or -1. So just above, up the top of calc movement, we can ask a question and say, if our right is equal to true, well then let's just set our H move to be 1. And I'll take a copy and paste of that, and make sure we drag it back under. And we want to say if left is equal to true, then H move is -1. And that'll just ensure that we can use H move down here with our HSP assigned variable. Now we are using H move here, but we're not using V move. So let's drag across an if check, and let's look at our V move variable. Now if V move is less than 0, now with GameMaker, if the V move is less than 0, that actually means that we're pushing the analog stick up. And if we're pushing the analog stick up, then we want to set our up variable to be true. And then we can take a copy and paste of that, make sure it's back under, and we'll ensure that if our V move is greater than 0, it means we're pushing the analog stick down. And therefore our down is true. Now remember, we're capturing this V move. If we go back here and look at our gamepad input, we're capturing it right here. And that's how we're determining whether V move is positive or negative. So if you want to test this, you can just change the up to jump and run that. And that will just allow you to see if the V move input is actually working. So now if I push up, I'll get the player jumping. Now you might notice something that happens here, and that's when I run into the enemy, I still just charge straight forward to them. I don't actually get knocked back anymore. So our knocked back is not actually working. So first I'll just change that jump back to up, and let's go have a look at why that's happening. So in our player, in our step event, and if we go down and look at our knockback script, we're actually using calc movement here. So because we're not capturing any input though, our H move stays at what it was when we moved into this state, and we continue to move forward. So we could either 0 H move, or we could just use our reset script to do it. So let's just use our reset script, and that will work. So you now have a dual control method, meaning you can switch between keyboard and gamepad. So let's test that out. Now we can bump into the enemies and we should get knocked back, which we do. And we can also at the same time use keyboard or gamepad. Either one will work. So we have dual controller support, which is really useful in your game. Now, I want to end with a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters. They help to build the channel and allow me to continue producing content for you. This month, I want to appreciate the generosity of my legendary supporters, Dylan Jackson, Fox and Raven, Ent, and Chris. Thanks as well to my epic supporters, Sky Devil Palm, Sheldon ENTP, Salvatore Capolino, and Claypot, as well as my other supporters. If you want to get access to source code, special videos, early access content, and even Udemy courses, the link is in the description. There are links in the description to my Udemy game course. Thanks for joining me. I'll talk to you in the next one.